action and adventure in the open seas. That's actually what we're going to observe or start to observe today as we delve into Acts chapter 27 in our study of the book of Acts. Hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. While you do have a sense of adventure, or observe a sense of adventure in chapter 27 with Paul and a whole crew sailing to Rome and being tossed by waves and storms and things like that, while it has the makings potentially of an interesting movie, let it be known right now that there is more to the story in Acts chapter 27 than just the fact that it's harrowing and adventurous. There's a lot more to that. In fact, what I hope that we see in all of this as we look at Acts chapter 27, both today and then continue on and finish up on that next week, is that we see how God reveals himself to several people who are, and when I say reveals himself, I'm not saying reveals to himself as if, he appears bodily to everybody or that he gives everybody on that boat a vision, but through the Apostle Paul, how God reveals himself as far as who he is to a ship full of people who, with the exception of two other people, I would say, are people who don't know the Lord. And so the storms that are experienced in all of this is a good setup for God to show who he is. And what an interesting thing. I was sort of thinking about this the other day, and just this whole idea of how God shows himself off to these people on the boat, and he uses Paul to do this. One of the things that I was thinking, or maybe like one of the things that maybe somebody who's on the side of a devil's advocate might think, contemplating the passage, would be, well, if God wanted to show himself in an amazing way, wouldn't it be more advantageous for him to miraculously keep storms and contrary winds and everything, keep that off the table, so that during this period of time when storms were most known to happen and crossing the Mediterranean Sea could be treacherous, if God just calmed all of that and they were able to get from point A to point B without any trouble, wouldn't that work just as well? And some people might argue to that effect and say that that would give a testimony to who God is if he were to do things like that. But it's interesting as it relates to human nature. I think that one thing that we understand, and I think God understands better than we ourselves understand, is that people's attention, a lot of people, God can work effectively in getting people's attention when they're in the midst of harrowing times. It's much more effective, I think. And, God can do it any way that he wants. But, just based on here and even just kind of things that I've known and I've heard of, just from other people's stories, God has a way of really grabbing people's attention when life isn't good, or when life is harrowing, or when there's dangers ahead and things like that. And so I think that what we see here with the storms and everything, as Paul and some other prisoners and crew and everything like that are trying to get to Italy so they can get to Rome. It's just interesting that God uses this storm the way that he does. I'm going to point out a couple of things here, just kind of as it just seems like God is arranging things as a setup to reveal himself to these different people who are on this boat trying to get to Rome. Now, the thing is that when you read, the rest of the text and everything, there's no indication really that there was a large revival or that many people came to the Lord or that sort of thing. And really, you don't need that information. What happened with these people after encountering everything they did and observing Paul and everything that he did? I don't know. The text doesn't say. But I wouldn't be surprised if you had some people, if we run into people in heaven, And they identify themselves as people who were on that boat, and they came to know the Lord after that whole thing. Now, again, that's just speculation. I'm just saying I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. Now, it very well could have been that a lot of people walked away from that whole thing, and none of them came to the Lord. Who knows? But I think that when you read this, when you read the account in chapter 27, I think it's helpful to look at this with the perspective of these people encountering God in a very unique way, and how God uses the Apostle Paul to make that revelation manifest before their eyes, and God using the storm to be able to do that. So that's just kind of the setup for what we're going to look at. A lot of what we're going to look at and what we're going to read, even pretty much through all of the chapter. We're not going to look at all of the chapter. We're going to break it up in two. But in much of this chapter, you're exposed to a lot of nautical language. And we can explain some of the things as we go along, but I want to be very careful not to get too bogged down on the details. I'll try and explain some things where it's important for us to do that, and then other cases not so much. What I really want to focus on is I want to focus on how God works in the midst of all of this. And that's really what I want to do. And it's very interesting, just given the fact that what we know that God has said to the Apostle Paul previously, when the Lord Jesus Christ himself revealed himself to Paul and said that you are going to testify about me, not only in this place, but you're going to in Rome, going to testify about me in Rome as well. And so in a sense, God gives his own testimony and uses the Apostle Paul in the process, even before they get to Rome. So that's just kind of an interesting thing to observe. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting study as we get ever more closer to the end of our study of the book of Acts. I anticipate that we are looking at 4 or 5 more episodes where we'll be looking at the book of we'll be looking at the book of Acts. 5 probably at the most is what I'm guessing. So in another 5 or so weeks we'll be done with Acts, and then after that we will be moving on to other things. So like I said, as far as chapter 27 is concerned, we will take this time and then next time to cover the whole chapter. Now remember how we've gotten to this point. Paul has been in captivity. We've been looking at him in a few handful of trials before governing authorities ever since chapter 22 of Acts, pretty much. And the theme that we've seen throughout this whole thing, every time Paul gives his defense, every time you have people who are rising up against him and announcing all of these charges against him, the continued theme that you see is that the people that Paul presents his defense to see nothing wrong with Paul and see that there's nothing that he has done or said that's deserving of imprisonment or death. Okay, so you get that from Felix, from Festus. The latest person, Agrippa, says the same thing. Now Agrippa, last time we left him, and that was a few weeks ago, because remember we've taken a couple weeks off, weeks break to cover some other things. So a few weeks ago, we looked at Paul and his defense before Agrippa, and so the way that things are left with Agrippa. Actually, let me back up, because let's remind ourselves of why Paul is talking to Agrippa in the first place. Because Paul has already presented his case to Festus. Festus, because of political motivations, just as the same most likely as you had going on with Felix, because of political environment and stuff like that, Festus is not too willing to let Paul, whom he knows is an innocent man, to let him go, in order to satiate the Jews. And so Paul, pretty much seeing what's going on here, says that, ends up appealing to Caesar. So all the proceedings that have been going on stop, and so they're going to make arrangements for him to go to Rome. The only problem is for Festus is that, he's got a right to Caesar and to the Roman court, indicating what the situation is and what this guy is charged with. And Festus still doesn't see what the problem is. So he needs help figuring out what to write. And so he appeals to Agrippa, pretty much. And Agrippa says, let me listen to the guy. So Agrippa and a whole bunch of nobles and military tribunes end up coming in the same room, and Paul gives his defense before them. Agrippa, pretty much has the same conclusion as everybody else, is that there's nothing wrong with Paul that's deserving of imprisonment or death. But instead of doing the right thing, because Paul doesn't have to be sent to Rome or to Caesar, Festus can just say, you're free to go. There's nothing wrong with this. But Festus, Agrippa, instead of doing the right thing, at the end of chapter 26 and in verse 32, it says, and Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar, which is kind of a weak sort of statement to make, because Festus, I keep saying Festus, Agrippa, it was certainly within Agrippa's power to do the right thing and to let Paul go. But instead, he uses this whole thing, well, you appeal to Caesar, I guess there's nothing that we can do about it, is kind of, I kind of see it as him using it as a shield to prevent him from doing the right thing that he needs to do. And perhaps he had the same political motivations as Festus and Felix did before him. So instead of Paul being let go, he's still in captivity, and they're going to send him off to Rome. Now, keep in mind that since this whole thing started when Paul was captured in Acts chapter 21, it's been at least 2 years. So this is if anybody was in Paul's sandals, you would imagine that this was a very tiring sort of thing. But one of the things that we saw, remember that what we saw this is that instead of focusing so much on the injustice of the whole thing, we see Paul taking opportunities as they're presented to them, as it's presented to him, to reach out to people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you get the sense that really is his number one main concern, is that people come to know the Lord. And in fact, we got that sense when he was talking to Agrippa, and Agrippa sniffed it out. And he was saying, hey, Paul, in such a short time, do you expect that I would become a Christian? And Paul essentially pretty much is admitting that that's what he's trying to do, didn't waffle away from it. And he says, not only you, but everybody else listening here, I wish that they would be like I am, except for these chains, right? So you have the gospel-centered, Christ-exalted attitude of Paul in non-ideal circumstances, where even then, his concern is that people come to know the Lord. And so because that's his concern, he finds ways to preach the gospel to people. Okay. And so that's the kind of person that we're dealing with in the person of the Apostle Paul. So that's just just reviewing all of that. That's where we are right now. Paul's is going to be heading off to Rome. And so in chapter 27 highlights the details of the voyage from Caesarea to Rome. Now, at first glance, when you just read through this chapter, you might wonder, okay, what really is the purpose of this? Why does Luke go into all of this detail? And it's a good question, but again, I'm going to go back to what I said before. I think one of the big things that we need to observe is we see how God reveals himself in a very interesting way to everybody who's on this ship, and uses Paul to do so. And so I think one of the things, here's another thing that I want to point out before we proceed further, is that it's going to be interesting, just to see how Paul is treated, at least initially, when this voyage gets started. Paul is treated very well and very kindly, and I think that some of that is owing to people understanding who Paul is, and even his character speaking for him. I mean, Paul, you're going to see some things here initially when we get into the passage that are things that are done for Paul that are just downright unusual. You don't see those sorts of things happening. And so I think that just based on Paul's character, how he's conducted himself through this whole time has gained him trustworthiness and credibility in the eyes of these non-believers, these unbelievers here. And you have some of these people in authority going out of their way to make sure that Paul is treated kindly as this voyage is getting underway. So I think that's very amazing. So just keep in mind all the things that we've seen as far as the conduct and the character of the Apostle Paul leading up to this point. And I think that in combination to God working in his favor kind of shows us something very neat, just as far as how things are working out for Paul as he's among this group of people. So I think that's something that's very interesting that'll be very interesting to know. So having said all of that, let's go ahead and delve into the text here. And I'm going to start out by reading verses 1 through 8 of chapter 27 here, so we can get started and see what we can come up with. So this is Acts chapter 27, starting in verse 1. And so it says, "And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends to be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra of Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy, and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmon. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea." Okay, so let's stop right there and just make some observations. So you see, just the details that are starting to emerge as we get into this whole voyage that goes from Caesarea to Rome here. And so when you go back to verse 1, there it says, "And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius." The Augustan cohort, as I understand it, is a group of soldiers that work directly for Caesar. Now, you could say that that any group of 100 soldiers were, in a sense, working for Caesar, but this was one that was directly tied to him, is my understanding. So this would have been a very elite group of soldiers, and which would have made this centurion Julius kind of an elite centurion, so he was put in charge of this whole voyage. So you have Paul, and you have a number of prisoners, some other prisoners, as it says here. What kind of prisoners, what they were charged with, what their crimes were, whatever, we don't know. But it's just interesting because you get a sense. I mean, there's nothing to indicate otherwise that these prisoners were actual real prisoners that were guilty of something, whether murder, theft, whatever the case may be. And so Paul is amongst these people. He's among these people as if he is like everybody else, a prisoner, which is just interesting because as we've seen throughout this whole time when we've been following Paul and listening to his defenses, we know that Paul is not a prisoner of any kind. Paul is completely innocent. Paul is totally righteous and walking in obedience to the Lord. I mean, Paul is an amazing character. And so here he is with a group of other criminals, other prisoners who are probably there justly. So it's just a very interesting picture that is painted in the mind when you see Paul being transported with these other prisoners. And so in verse 2 it says, "And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica." Okay, so in addition to the prisoners, in addition to the centurion, Julius the centurion, you also have two other people that accompany Paul, and these are people who are directly tied to the Apostle Paul in very relational ways. One of them we see right here at the end of verse 2, Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. We've actually seen Aristarchus before. He's mentioned in chapter 20. He's also mentioned in the chapter before that, chapter 19. He was one of the people that was dragged off in front of the crowd when that riot in Ephesus broke out. So Aristarchus was one of those people. So we've seen Aristarchus before, and we see him here again. Now, I said that there were other people that accompanied Paul. You might wonder who that other person is, because we don't see any other name that shows up here. Well, if you look at in verse 2, remember it says, "And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the port along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus." So there again, we're exposed again to the first person plural, we, which indicates that Luke was along for the ride as well. So Luke has now joined in the story. So everything that we're seeing now and everything that we're going to see as far as the storms and everything like that, Luke is an actual eyewitness of everything that's happening here. So Luke is accompanying Paul, and so is Aristarchus. Now, this is highly unusual. You were never going to see something like this, where a prisoner's companions were able to accompany the prisoner on the ship if they're being transported from one place to another. That just didn't happen. So here again, you see kind of the gracious hand of God, I think, working through here. Maybe Luke used his credentials as a physician. I don't know. And just saying I'd like to accompany Paul as his personal physician. I don't know. How they were able to score points as far as being able to jump on board ship is not known. But the fact of the matter is that they were on board ship. That's highly unusual, and so there you kind of get a sense that they're doing Paul some favors here. Maybe from the centurion standpoint, they're thinking maybe that's the least that we can do, or one of the least of the things that we can do, just given what Paul has been through and just knowing. And I'm pretty sure that the centurion knew. I'm pretty sure that he had news of who Paul was, knowing that Paul's not a dangerous guy. He's not a criminal or anything like that. And after all that he's been through, and as much time that he's been behind bars, that he's granted this favor of having a couple of his companions joining him on this trip. All this to say, it's a very gracious thing that's happening for him with these companions being allowed to accompany him. But as you see later in the next verse, in verse 3, the favors go even further, because it says in verse 3, "The next day we put in at Sidon." So they went a little bit north. That's how they started to sail. Sidon is north from there, and they put in there the next day. And so it says, "And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for." Now, this is super duper 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 unusual, especially given the situation, because whatever one might think positively about Paul, the fact still remains that Paul is a prisoner, and he is under the specific watch of the centurion. Okay, so as things go within that system, I think that we've talked about this before, is that when a soldier was kept in was guarding somebody, a prisoner, if that prisoner somehow escaped, then the person who was guarding that prisoner would pay most of the time. It was usually pay with his life, and we've seen examples of this even in past studies before in the book of Acts. So the fact that the centurion just allows Paul to, when they dock at Sidon, to be able to go out there and just to for Paul to see his friends, tells you something pretty significant regarding how the centurion saw Paul, and maybe how other people saw Paul, because maybe some information was fed to the centurion about who Paul was and just how much of a trustworthy guy he is. And I think that's the underlying thing. Paul was seen as a person who was incredibly trustworthy. You'd have to see Paul in that light in order for this centurion to be able to allow Paul to do what he did. okay? Because that's a huge gamble. If he's wrong about who Paul is, or who he thinks Paul is, just as far as his character goes, and Paul just decides to run away, taking advantage of the free rein that the centurion gave him, that centurion is in big trouble, and that centurion can lose his life. But it doesn't seem like that it's a big thing for this centurion, Julius, to let Paul go, and to be able to visit his friends inside. And so that really says something about Paul's character, even in the midst of everything that he's gone through. Paul is able to maintain good character, good godly character, shows himself as a trustworthy individual, where these people, and granted, and listen, unbelievers, I think this is Paul's testimony in the midst of unbelievers, where unbelievers are able to say, this person is a trustworthy person. I have no problem. You actually see the same thing with Joseph. I mean, if you even think about way back in Genesis, the person and the character of Joseph, you saw that, people like Potiphar and even the jailers that ran the jail that Joseph was locked up in. One of the testimonies of Scripture, talks about from their perspective, it says that they didn't concern themselves with anything when things were put under the charge of Joseph. That speaks of high trustworthiness. And so this, if anything, if we are to draw something out of this is a really important call for all of us as believers, to be people who live a life that is consistent with who we claim to be in Christ, and to be people who come across as people of integrity, people who can be trusted, and that sort of thing. So I think that this is a huge testimony to the person and the character of Paul, just based on what he's allowed to do. And so it says that he treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. Who these friends are, I don't know. I don't think we even knew before this point that Paul had friends or relationships in Sidon, but he did, and they cared for him. Perhaps refreshed him. Perhaps he wasn't feeling very well. They took care of him in the time that they were in Sidon. Okay, and so when you continue in verse 4. It says, and putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. So the lee of Cyprus, the lee being the side of an island that protects, that serves as a protection or a shield from contrary winds. Okay, so that's what the lee was. So the lee of Cyprus was that side of the island that blocks the wind. Okay, so they're going under the lee of Cyprus. Verse 5, it says, and when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. Okay, there, let's see, verse 6. There the centurion found the ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. And so, for reasons that perhaps that aren't given, where you can speculate, they changed ships. Maybe the ship that they were going on was going to be going in a different direction or whatever. Maybe the ship that they were getting on now was a bigger boat. Maybe they could spread people out a little bit more. Who knows? But the important thing is that they found a ship that was going to Rome. That was an Alexandrian ship. Most likely, what you have here is a ship that is transporting grain, because Rome got a lot of its grain supply from places like Africa, which is where Alexandria is. It's capital of Egypt at that time. So you have this in all likelihood a grain ship or a wheat ship. Well, not a wheat ship. I mean, I'm sure it had a lot of other cargo and stuff too, but one of the main things it had there was grain and wheat and stuff like that. That's there at Lycia, and so they are granted access there to jump on board the ship and to go on this boat all the way to Rome. Okay, and so verse 7. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmon. Now, you're going to see this term maybe a few other times, one or two other times, this whole thing with difficulty. So right off, we're starting to see that, the sailing conditions, that sailing even in this initial spot of their journey, wasn't exactly easy. It's not treacherous, it's not dangerous yet, but it is difficult. And so it says with difficulty, as it says there in verse 7, arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmon. So they're starting to take a southerly direction. Cnidus was at the tip, the southwestern tip, I believe, of the province of Asia. And so as they're going past there, they're going north of a place called Rhodes, and they're making a southwesterly direction towards the island of Crete. It might be helpful if you have maps in the back of your Bible, or if you have any other sort of map resource, biblical map resource. It would be helpful to look at the direction that this voyage is going. If you have a map in the back of your Bible, I'm pretty sure that one of the things that are cataloged there is Paul's voyage to Rome. And so when you look at that map, you see just kind of the direction that the ship was going. So they're going in a southwesterly direction now. They're going away from Asia Minor, and they're going towards Crete. And as it says there, they're going under the lee of Crete at a place at the place called right off of Salmon, which is on the east side of that island of Crete. So in verse 8, it says, coasting along it, here it is again, with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Okay, so they've gone under the lee, and now they're going on the southern portion of the island of Crete. And they come to a place called Fair Havens. Okay, now they've gone along the coast with difficulty, until they've come to this point. Okay, now before we go further, let me just lay out for you, because this will give us a little bit of a understanding of what we're going to see in the verses to follow here. Here's the thing: there are certain times of the year where it wasn't bad to cross the Mediterranean or to sail the Mediterranean. And then there were other times of the year where it was treacherous. Sometimes because the weather was predictable during that time of year. Other times it was just a gamble. You didn't know. But the chances of hitting very violent storms, very violent and deadly storms, was a good chance of those cropping up during specific periods of time. One of those times where travel could be particularly treacherous and where you didn't have a lot of ships out on the Mediterranean Sea was the time from mid-September to mid-November. Now, historians can look back, and just based on the history that's laid out of what they know about the reign of Agrippa and for example, when Festus came to power and that sort of thing, they're able to pinpoint the years where Paul actually the month and the year and everything where Paul is facing Festus and Agrippa and things like that. Just based on that information, you can come to the conclusion that that when Paul and everybody set sail for Rome, we're probably talking about mid to late August, perhaps. So remember, from mid-September to mid-November, we're talking about September 14th-ish to about November 11th-ish. Around that time was a time where boats on the Mediterranean Sea, that was very dangerous to do. It was a very dangerous undertaking. So you didn't have a lot of people sailing the Mediterranean Sea during that time. Okay, so they've a lot of time. Just if you look at the map and look at the course that's been taken. And just given the technology of boats back at that time, you can imagine that a significant time has already passed. Okay, and so given the time of year and the dangers that lay ahead, you have certain decisions to make of whether to go on or whether to stay and that sort of thing. Because you had to take into consideration what the weather might be like, if they decide to go further. And trust me, when you're crossing the Mediterranean Sea, you do not want to be caught in a violent storm. You just didn't. It was very treacherous to travel during that time. And so a lot of ships docked at certain places and they wintered there. I mean, we'll come across that term here in a couple of areas here in the text that we read, which means that they won't set out to sail. They'll stay docked where they are for, you have people there for maybe 2 or 3 months, until it's safe to cross again. So we're not just talking about a 1 or 2 night stay here. We're talking about a good chunk of weeks here, a few months without sailing. And so when you take into account also the fact that you have people who are out on the water for commerce purposes, a lot of important decisions have to be made, because you have people who are in the business of selling their food, and they're trying to deliver their food to particular ports and to particular harbors, all a part of business. So keep that in mind as we're going through this text as well. But when you pick up in verse 9, let's look at verses 9 through 12. It says, the description continues. It says, since much time had passed. So there again is what I mentioned before, the passage of time. Okay, and if we're talking about mid to late August and much time has passed, we're getting we're in that, around that time of treacherous season. And even in this verse, you see as much. So it says, let me just read the passage again. It says, so much time, since much time had passed, because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Okay, so here you have the situation. They're at Fair Havens. And so notice what it says in verse 9. It says, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over. Now, what's the fast? The fast that's being referred to here is the fast on the Day of Atonement, right? So if we're talking about the fast being over, we're talking about early October when they're at Fair Havens. Now, remember what I said. Mid-September to mid-November is that treacherous point. So they're very much smack dab in the middle of that treacherous time. And so that's what even Luke is saying here, which gives us an understanding of what he knew about sailing the seas and things like that. It was dangerous because even the fast was already over. So he knew the month, he knew the time of year that it was, and knew that travel could be dangerous. And so here comes Paul. Now, keep in mind who Paul is relative to everybody else on the ship. I mean, especially as it relates to the owner of the ship, the crew, and everything like that. Here comes Paul in verse 10, where he says, sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. So he's saying, look, if we continue to move on, that's not going to be a good idea, because we're going to lose the ship, we're going to lose the cargo, and people are going to die. Maybe a majority of them, maybe all of them, I don't know. But Paul is saying this is dangerous, so it's probably going to be a better idea. This is the implied suggestion that is being made by the Apostle Paul, saying we need to stay put and not move out anywhere. It'll be to our advantage to do that. If we don't, then we're putting the ship and everybody else at risk. In verse 11, though, it says, but the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than what Paul said. Now, really, in a large sense, you can't necessarily blame the centurion for doing this. I mean, put yourself in his sandals. You have Paul. I mean, who is Paul? But just this religious prisoner. And then you have people who know the ship best. They have an understanding of the treachery that's out, the treacherous dangers that are out there and everything like that. The centurion is going to rely on their expertise in making a decision there. So I don't necessarily fault the centurion for not listening to Paul. It is noteworthy that he didn't listen to Paul, and that's something that we're going to see in the text later on. Just let it be known that Paul lays it out there. He says, look, this isn't going to be a good idea to go further. We're going to lose the ship, we're going to lose the cargo, and we're going to lose our lives. The centurion instead listens to the pilot, which you would think that he would know. He would know what to do. Now, again, though, keep in mind the time of year. This is smack dab in the middle of the dangerous season. So you have a few things going on here that I think are unusual. A couple of things, I guess, that seems somewhat unusual, which gives me the understanding that that everything that's going to be worked out here, is under the guiding hand of God to set up that situation where God is going to reveal himself to these people in the midst of a very treacherous storm. Okay, so the first thing that you see there is that, again, as I said, not surprisingly, the centurion doesn't listen to Paul, but he listens to the owner of the ship and the pilot and everything. But as it says here, as it goes on here, verse 12, it says, and because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, listen to this, the majority decided to put out to sea from there. Now, let's stop right there, because I think that's interesting. You have the owner of the ship and you have the pilot, and at the very least, the pilot, you would think that, or you would hope that that he's running on some sense of expertise, and that if there's any sort of decision that's going to be made, it's going to be him and maybe the owner and like maybe a couple other people. But it says there the majority decided to put out to sea. So I'm left wondering when I'm reading that, what happened? I mean, they just decide to take a vote? I mean, that seems to be very unusual to me. And so there you see that the majority of the people on that ship were in favor of moving on from Fair Havens. Okay, which gives us keep in mind the scenario here. See where this puts Paul. Paul is definitely in the minority. And this is a case in point in a situation where you see quite clearly, and we're going to see as the text unfolds, that the majority is not always right. As far as we can see from the text, Paul is the only one who is saying, look, we shouldn't go any further. The majority says, we need to move here. Now, one of the big reasons for that, as it says there at the beginning of verse 12, it says, and because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in. And some of that may be due to a couple of factors. Number one, the harbor itself, where just the makeup of the harbor, it didn't provide enough shelter from any of the storms that would come about. And then number two, supplies may have been somewhat limited. Lacia was probably a very small community, so it didn't have much to offer. So if you're gonna spend the winter there and you're gonna spend a few months there, I think the thinking is that you want to be somewhere else where you have more supplies at your disposal. Otherwise, I think from the perspective of the owner of the ship, it's going to cost him much more. I mean, just as far as taking care of everybody on the ship and everything. And so, from his perspective, I think he would be one who would want to move on as well. But it says there. The majority, this is still verse 12, the majority decided to put out to sea from there. Listen to this, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix. So this is all of this is laying forth for you this whole thing of, if they move, it's a gamble, and everybody knows it's a gamble. Everybody knows that that they're taking a chance here. The smarter thing would have been to consider would be, let's stay put here because we don't know. The weather can just be so unpredictable, and so but from most people's perspective, they're saying, okay, the majority has decided, and the majority says, let's take this chance. Let's somehow make our way to Phoenix. So everything looks a little bit shaky, but I think all of this, again, works towards that setup of what God is going to do in using the upcoming storm to show him off for who he really is. Okay, and so as it says they're going to try and reach Phoenix, which, as the verse 12 says it's a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So they had their eyes set on Phoenix. They were with the understanding that that Phoenix was a much better place to harbor in at. So when you start at verse 13, let me read another range of verses here, verses 13 through 20. It says, now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete. close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty, there it is that word again, with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Okay, so there you have, the buildup of the situation there. Now at first, it looked like everything was going swimmingly. The way that they were going. So they're starting to travel. They're starting to travel west towards Phoenix, which is about, if I remember correctly, about 40 miles west, and it's on the other side of the island of Crete. So that's where they're trying to go. And so it says, now when the south wind blew gently, so we're not dealing with any sort of harsh wind. It's a gentle wind. It says, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. So there they are, just going along, just as they thought that they were supposed to. Now you get into verse 14. It says, but a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. Now the northeaster was a very, very strong wind. It came in over a range of mountains and was really, really strong. Again, something that was not unusual around this time of year. This is, for anybody sailing on the Mediterranean during this time of the year, this was one of the winds or the storms that people would have been most afraid of, perhaps. And so, lo and behold, they take this gamble and say, we're going to try and go those 40 miles to Phoenix and hope that we get there safely. And sure enough, as they start to go along, it starts out pretty good at first, but then the northeaster comes, and man, you just don't want to get caught in that northeaster. That northeaster is something else. Okay, is the understanding that we're supposed to get here. So it struck down from the land. You continue in verse 15. It says, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. So you're now at a spot where you've lost control, and now you're at the mercy of the wind wherever it takes you here, which isn't the most comforting position to be in. And so it says in verse 16, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. Now the ship's boat was this other boat that was towed along behind the actual ship. So the ship's boat is, you had certain supplies on there. It could also serve as a lifeboat, I guess you could say, under very, very treacherous winds, I guess you could say, or treacherous storms. They weren't ready to use that exactly quite yet, but this is another boat that was towed behind the actual ship. Okay, and so with the winds and the waves and everything like that, getting violent because of this northeaster, it stood a great chance for being damaged, being towed from behind. And so what they would do, as it says here, let's just read in verse 17. It says, after hoisting the ship's boat up, after hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. So they imagine this is a boat, and this isn't a small boat. We're not talking about a rowboat or anything. This is, you would imagine it's somewhat smaller than the actual ship, obviously, but it's something that is, it's a pretty decent size. So you're probably going to need a lot of hands to hoist up the ship and to get it onto the deck, this boat, and hoist it up onto the deck of the ship. That's basically what they were doing. Okay, so and this isn't just a simple 5-minute job. This was something that was going to be difficult to do. So all hands on deck. This is what they're doing, and this was to save that ship so that it wouldn't get destroyed. So notice it says after hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Now, these supports were cables that were used that ran along the bottom of the ship, and they were hooked up over the ship and onto the deck and onto the surface of the boat, and fastened on in different parts of the boat. And the reason for that was that in situations like this, when there are violent winds and violent waves, that kept the ship together to help prevent it from breaking apart. Now, eventually, it's going to happen down the line. We know that everybody gets that they experience a shipwreck. That's not going to be until much later in the chapter, and we're going to look at that next time. But that was the purpose of this whole thing, to undergird the ship is tightening those cables together on the ship to keep the slats, the wood slats together of that ship, so it didn't break apart. Still in verse 17, it says, Then fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear and thus were driven along. So the Syrtis was an area off the coast of Africa that was kind of seen, I believe, as a ship's graveyard, because it had a lot of sandbars and shoals there that just wrecked ships that were driven by the wind during times like this, and broke the ships apart. So you probably had a lot of debris and stuff there from ships that met their untimely end there. So they're trying to avoid this place as much as possible. So they lower the gear. And the gear most likely is the sea anchors. So they lower that gear, and thus are driven along. Now, verse 18, it says, Since we were violently storm tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. They want to lighten the load, because as the ship is there weighed down on the water, as the winds and the waves are increasing. The waves are going to probably just kind of gush up over the ship, and it's just gonna fall on the deck of the ship and everything like that. They want to lighten the load so that as the wind goes, that it's able to hoist up more with the sails to prevent all of those waves and stuff from crashing onto the ship. Is probably what you have going on there. So they're jettisoning the cargo. Okay, that's on board the ship. Now, verse 19, it says, And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Now listen, the ship's tackle was just tools, and a lot of those tools were very important tools. And that's not something to get rid of. The tackle is not a decision that you make lightly. So it's a big deal that they jettison that stuff. And it's interesting that Luke adds in there, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. I think that's added there to give you the understanding that this wasn't an accident. You didn't lose this in the course of the storm by accident. They purposely did this. That gives you an understanding of just how serious the situation is on board the ship. Now, in verse 20, it says, When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So you have the ship, you have the crew in what looks like its most helpless situation. So much to the point that everybody has now lost heart, and they've lost all hope that they're going to be saved. And so pretty much what they're thinking is that we're all going to die. This is it. And so, being in the midst of the sea, and you're not able to see anything. And again, sun or stars or anything haven't appeared for a long time. Which would have been helpful in navigating and things like that. And so none of that appears, and so their hope is gone. Their hope is gone. So now that they're at the very bottom, now here comes Paul. And so here comes Paul, who in this situation, and God, I think God orchestrates this to kind of shine forth who he is in the midst of the storm. Okay, and that's the point. Now, they're in a good spot right now. I mean, just as far as that goes, with what we just read in verse 20, where it says that all hope of being saved was at last abandoned. So again, you get that helplessness, and they're at rock bottom, and they just given up. So now, when you get to verse 21, let me read the next section of verses here. And this section here is the last section we're going to look at here, verses 21 through 26. And so it says, Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.'" Okay, so there's a situation there where the crew, everybody's at rock bottom. And Paul probably was even in a state where he was afraid. I mean, the revelation that was given to him, it says, "Don't be afraid, Paul," which may have indicated that Paul was very frightened and afraid and everything as well. But you notice there in verse 21, it says, "Since they had been without food for a long time." Now, that could have been for several reasons. One of them being, and it's been suggested that with everything going on, you had a lot of people who were seasick. You didn't feel like eating when you're seasick in the midst of a major storm. That could be. Another thing could be, though, that they're so busy trying to maintain the ship that they just didn't have time to eat. That plus the fact that they were scared for their lives. I mean, they weren't even in the mood to eat. You know that if you're weighed down with so much fear and stuff like that, your appetite is gone. Maybe you've been in a situation like that before. And you get a sense that that's kind of what it was like. You're going to see this next time in the passages to follow, where that could explain some of the reasons why they hadn't been eating. But They hadn't been eating. But Paul here, still in verse 21, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss." So yeah, it's kind of a mild "I told you so," I guess. But in some sense, this earns a little bit of credibility on Paul's part. And Paul's saying, "Look, I pointed out to you guys that this wasn't the course that we should have taken. And now you see that I'm correct." Now, Paul isn't saying that to rub salt in the wound or anything like that, but it does speak to his credibility, even though he's not a professional sailor or shipman or something like that. This kind of establishes something where it says, man, maybe we should have listened to this guy before. But not only that, but as Paul is going to continue to say, Paul is going to identify himself with the God of the Bible, just based on a revelation that's brought to him, where it outlines what's going to happen to the ship and to the crew. Now, if Paul can speak on this with certainty, with certainty, that's going to go a long way in God's purpose in all of this, and God revealing himself as far as who he is to the ship of people who are unbelievers. Okay. In verse 22, he says, "Yet now I urge you to take heart." Okay, which is maybe a hard thing to swallow, or maybe something where you kind of laugh, like, take heart. Have you looked around? Have you seen the situation that we're in, Mr. Paul? But he says, "I urge you to take heart." Now, why? Just to take heart? Is Paul just being a cheerleader here? No, he says, he goes on to say, in verse 22 there, it says, "For there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship." Okay, how does he know this? Verse 23, "For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship." Now, I like how he phrases that there. Paul is there, and he pretty much identifies himself as, "This is the God that I serve. This is the God that I worship here." And this is what he says. So basically, he's saying that anything that's said from this point on, if they latch on to what God says, then anything that's said forward, as far as what Paul is saying, they can identify perhaps with what God is leading him to say, and therefore they put trust in what God is doing and what God is leading in this situation. And it really heightens, the testimony of God to a very great degree. So that very night, Paul says, he said that there was an angel of the God whom I belong. Okay. And so listen, if everything unfolds the way it's supposed to, and everybody's life is spared, sure, the ship is lost as it said it was going to happen, but if lives are spared, And you kind of have this idea of like, this happened at the hands of a God. This salvation happened at the hands of a God to whom Paul belongs. What is it about that guy's God that deserves some great attention? Because we just saw something wondrous here. And so that's the setup that we're going to see. And as we see, by the time you get to the end of the chapter, you see that everything that Paul had said that had been revealed to him actually had come to pass, which would speak tremendously to this ship full of unbelievers. It says, for this very night stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. Verse 24, and he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. Okay, so one way or the other, Paul. We know that Paul is going to make it to Rome. Maybe some other people. Somebody might think, well, maybe some other people die, but maybe Paul survives. Now we do know that Paul is going to survive because the angel says you are going to testify before Caesar. That will happen. So obviously that means you are going to get to Rome. And so so that for Paul is going to be is a sure thing, but it doesn't stop with just Paul. And here's is kind of that common grace that you kind of see here, because the salvation is going to, and when I say salvation, I'm talking about salvation from the situation, the storm situation, extends to other people of the ship, all of whom, with the exception of Aristarchus and Luke, are not believers, and yet God works on their behalf. So you see how the testimony is starting to manifest itself there. It says, so he says, Paul, you must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Okay, so that's what. So pretty much he's saying everybody's life is going to be spared. Nobody's going to die. So take heart, because nobody's going to die. Now listen, Paul told the whole truth, and there was a bit of bad news about this, and that the ship was going to be lost. So Paul wasn't afraid to lay that out there. It was sort of a good news, bad news situation. And so Paul was honest, which was good, but at least it's not going to lead to loss of life. I mean, if you had to choose one, I'm pretty sure, what would you rather lose, your life or the ship? The answer is obvious. Okay. And so in verse 25 it says, so take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. Now that is really, really, really great. Paul declares unashamedly and very boldly, and I think that this says something, and I think this says something. This is a word for us as well. Paul is able to say, that I believe what has been told me. Now listen. Being exposed, having an opportunity to display one's faith in the midst of unbelievers can really, really speak to a group of people, I think. To be somebody who takes God at his word and says, this is what God has said, therefore I believe that this is going to happen, I think is a huge thing. I think one of the problems with the church and Christianity today is that we have the Bible, for example. We have the Bible. We have what God says. We, in many places, know what God has said. But then when it comes to living out life, and even in the difficult parts of life, we fear and we treat God as if he is not powerful enough to meet our needs, to see us through whatever situation we're going through, and that sort of thing. And so in so many cases, that sort of attitude is displayed in front of non-believers. Now, if these non-believers are people who know that you're a Christian, what does that say about what you believe about your God, right? And so, being somebody who stands firm in faith, and not just faith as just this general nebulous sort of thing, but faith in what God has said and what God has revealed. For us, we know that that's the case just based on things that are revealed to us through Scripture. Here in a vision, we're dealing with something different here. But nevertheless, whatever the case is, we're dealing with a word that was delivered from God. That's the thing. That's the point. And so Paul, being a follower of God, belongs to God and who worships him, says, look, I believe, when God says it, I believe it. And so I believe that what he says, what he has said about this will come to pass. And so with that declaration, what a thing that'll be, a testimony that would be when everything does come to pass later on in the chapter. You see what I'm saying? So just that statement is so wonderful. So he says to them, take heart. And he says, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. And then verse 26, he says, but we must run aground on some islands. So there's the bad news situation. But everybody's life is going to be spared, okay? And that's the good thing. So we've seen a lot here up to this point. We're going to leave it there. We've seen a lot up to this point as far as the adventure on the open seas, okay? And there's a little bit more of it to go that we'll cover next time when we finish up the rest of chapter 27. So we're left hanging once again in the book of Acts, and we'll have to wait till next time to see how the rest of the story unfolds. So stay with us and come back next time so we can get the rest of the story in chapter 27, and even just seeing what happens with Paul and everything, and the testimony of him, and just how things unfold in chapter 28 as well. It's going to bleed over into chapter 28. So we're going to get to see some exciting things in that chapter as well. So to be continued, ... right? That's where we are right now in chapter 27. So we'll leave it there. If you enjoy this show, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts and also on Google Play. You can also check out Loving the Scriptures on Twitter and follow Loving the Scriptures on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right. We will get a more insight onto things that happens with the Apostle Paul and the rest of the crew, and how God shines forth in the midst of the storm. Can't wait to go over that with you. I enjoyed my time here, as I always do. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.